Today's lecture, like I said, I'm kind of discussing like the rest of the Great Depression, especially dealing with the so-called Second New Deal that they have with FDR. And I will kind of start focusing more also into like the beginning of World War II also as well. Hey, Jennifer, yeah, I see you. You're there pretty much. So, yeah. So anyway, so I'm going to talk about that today. And then later in the week, I'll, of course, get into World War II and finish that up pretty much in my later lectures that we'll have in the week. So we're still going to have 3 lectures this week. They'll just, the World War II ones will mostly be on Tuesday, Thursdays. So anyway, of course, like from last time I had talked about, I think we kind of talked about the Great Depression, I know, in my previous lecture, and I kind of got into the New Deal, which I think primarily we talked about the so-called First New Deal. So today I'm going to, of course, continue with, we'll kind of talk about some of the different New Deal programs that they have out there. I think one of the first I'm going to talk about that was part of the Second New Deal was the NRA, that they sometimes call it for short, that they had. But the so-called New Deal is split. I'll kind of give you the dates on it, but usually First New Deal is about 1933 to about 35. And then you can see that the second so-called New Deal that they have was around 1935, roughly up to about 1938. So some of these I'm kind of talking about are kind of like both of them that they have overall. But the one I'll talk about first, I guess, that's also kind of controversial that came in, you see there, is the so-called NRA, they sometimes call it, or the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the NRA, which stood for the National Recovery Agency. That was supposed to help, I guess, save the country from the Great Depression and all that. And it was mostly created to stimulate like industrial output or production in the country, which I guess had fallen off since, the Great Depression started in the early 30s. And it was supported by a bunch of industries that were backed by the federal government. And of course, if you know about it, what happened with it was kind of a way where the government was trying to control what industries people could buy from or businesses. And consumers were advised only to buy from NRA associated products, if you know about this. And of course, they had that famous logo they use, which I think I've got a better picture on this picture here, which shows the blue eagle. It's got the gear with the lightning bolts with it. And there was a motto that went with it, you may have heard of, which is "We do our part." And so people would put these stickers on their windows that were, I guess, supportive of the NRA. But it was controversial, by the way. And it was enforced by the National Recovery Agency, which was created in 1933, which you see there. And you can see Congress appropriated something like $500 million for relief to help out the needy people, during the Great Depression. You can see it also helped create the CCC, which I think I already talked about, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put a lot of young men to work in the country doing conservation work and so on, building forests and so on, like we talked about. And it also helped establish the PWA. We talked about that also already as well, which spent something like, you see, $3.3 billion doing various public works throughout the country. That was all done not just to create industrial output, but also to put a lot of people to work that were unemployed throughout the country. He said also it's supposed to also create more fair business practice. That was another thing that they did as well. We saw it right here. It was created to eliminate a lot of cutthroat competition, which had apparently happened before that, I guess, going back to the Roaring 20s. And so that's one of the reasons why they supposedly developed it. Hey, what's going on? Good afternoon. Hope you're doing great out there. But so anyway, now the only thing about the NRA, you study about it, it was declared unconstitutional. It's one of the most controversial by the way, acts or agencies that was part of the New Deal that was there. There was a court case called Schechter versus United States. Some kind of poultry business or something sued the U.S. government because they were trying to, I guess, regulate it too much. And so Supreme Court came in and said that the federal government had no right to regulate every aspect of business. And so they basically, eventually after 1935, they got rid of it, basically. But some of those agencies that were kind of part of it, like the CCC, PWA, kind of continue later, that they have. But that actual agency was closed down because it was considered unconstitutional. Now, they have this other thing, too, I did want to mention about, which I can find it right here. There it is right there, the NLRA, which is the National Labor Relations Act, which also had the so-called National Labor Relations Board. That was part of it. And it was part of an act called the Wagner Act. That was the other name that they called it, which came out in 1935. And what the NLRB, I guess, did, more or less, it was an arbitration board to settle labor disputes between like companies or businesses and their employees. And so it's one of the first cases where the federal government stepped in and it allowed this to occur, like legally, and like arbitration, et cetera. And it also led to the rise of labor unions becoming more powerful, which they will, especially after World War II. They become real powerful. Even though the NRA was gone, I think it was part of that, I believe. It was kind of passed at the same time, I know. But it's kind of around the same time this all came out. But that's the first case where you have a deal where, like I said, the federal government starts recognizing actual, unions and things like that, and workers organizing, strikes, collective bargaining, things like that, which are there. And you can see other things, of course, it did too, as well. So yeah, they could join unions legally. You can see they also kind of tried to ban unfair labor practices, also as well. It also investigated complaints against, unfair practices, by labor in general, things like that. So there's different things you see in that list right there that the Wagner Act in the NLRB, or National Labor Relations Board, of course, was famous for. There's other things, too, that were part of, like, I guess what would be later the so-called Second New Deal, I guess, later. But you've got the Securities Exchange Commission, that came into fruition by 1934-35, which, of course, that's basically a famous, agency that was created to regulate the stock market. In fact, it was created because of the fact that, the stock market had crashed in 1929. So it was, created to protect investors, more or less, and begin some kind of regulation of it, which did not exist before in the country. And so you can see it did other things too. Later, not now, but later it's going to also regulate electronics securities. You start getting computers and things like that later, that you've got. But it also cracked down on insider trading. It's one of the things that the SEC does. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, Wall Street. Charlie Sheen, I think, is in it, and Michael Douglas, and where, the SEC comes in there and cracks down insider trading, like that, arrests people for that. And that's constantly going on. I think Martha Stewart got in trouble with that years ago for having some kind of insider trading or something like that, I believe, as an example. So, and you can go to prison for that, for many years for doing things like that. Those are examples right there. What else? I don't think we talked about the REA. I don't know if I remember doing that. I don't think I did. That was another thing, of course, that was also famous, was the Rural Electric Administration, REA for short. What that did was it helped provide electricity for like rural areas that were very isolated throughout America, especially like farming communities was the area they were trying to go after the most. And So yeah, farmers, that was one thing. And so they start doing that, especially by 1936, I think is when it got started, roughly. So they funded a lot of like federal loans were channeled through various cooperative electric power companies to basically, get people electricity, not just electricity, but phone service too, also as well. And I can remember my mom telling me about this like years ago. She lived in Livonia, Louisiana, which is kind of in Point Capee Parish. And, they didn't have hardly any utilities or anything like that. Like no phone line, no phone, no electricity, no running water or anything. They lived on a farm, my mom, she did, her family, they're farmers. Anyway, I think they had an outhouse, something like that. I remember she telling me all that. They didn't have a car. They didn't have anything. So anyway, so yeah, that's kind of trying to, modernize, parts of America. You get them more into the 20th century by, getting the electricity, phone service, and things like that as a whole. You may have heard of the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. That was also another big thing that was part of the New Deal as well, which is still around today, the TVA. And the TVA is, of course, a current government agency of the federal government that, of course, controls a lot of the Tennessee River, like a lot of the dams along the river. And what happened was in the 1930s, they started constructing about 21 dams and locks. They were built along the Tennessee River. It was done for two reasons. One, it was done for providing electricity throughout that area. You're looking at the map, that green area, dark green area. Those areas are very impoverished in parts of like Tennessee and the surrounding areas. And also it was done to create flood control around the Tennessee River as well. Also the Appalachian Mountains, which are very impoverished still today, be able to get electricity to them. And a total of 7 states, by the way, were covered under it. Besides Tennessee, you see Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, parts of Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia also as well, also get electricity as well from that. It later was criticized. I don't know if you know about TVA. Some people still don't like the TVA because they thought that it kind of was like a cheap form of electricity that where, private companies couldn't compete. That's kind of an issue I know they've talked about. And some people complain about the fact that some electricity wasn't gotten to certain areas of that region, which probably needed electricity and didn't get it. So not everybody got everything they wanted, I guess, out of that. But it is something that's still there today. It's one of those New Deal programs that, like I said, at least like 5 to 10 New Deal programs are still kind of around overall. Now, I'm also going to get into today, I'm going to talk about some of these other New Deal programs that they have. They have a lot of different, New Deal programs that kind of, are created up to, like, I want to say 1938, which is when they stopped creating them, by the way. And you have like a lot of these anti-New Dealers that start kind of criticizing FDR because they think that he's either, not doing enough to save, help the people and the economy, or they're criticizing for other things as well. And so a lot of these were like a combination of politicians. Some were in his own party, some were Republicans, some were just like private citizens that just, didn't agree with him, or they also wanted to add things to like the New Deal that they thought they ought to create other programs that are out there. Now, I'll kind of go through there and talk about some of these. Of course, the top 3 right there you see is, of course, Father Coughlin was one of them, Charles Coughlin, Dr. Francis Townsend, and had Huey Long from Louisiana. Everybody's heard of course, here in Louisiana where we're at. And so we'll kind of talk about those that were, of course, very, very famous. Of course, they had this guy here, which is Father Charles Coughlin, of course, the so-called radio priest. He, of course, is one of the most famous around the 1930s. That was, real big anti-New Dealer who didn't agree with FDR. And he was from Canada originally. They came to Detroit, Michigan. And what happened was he started a radio show, like a weekly broadcast from there. And over time, he got something like 30 to 40 million people to listen to him. He was very popular on the radio. And he's kind of, in comparison to like Rush Limbaugh. I remember him just died recently. I think Rush had something like about the same amount, like something like 40 million people that listened to him. He was very influential, especially on conservative values and things like that. But he heavily criticized FDR's policies. Like I think one of the big things he wanted to do, you can see there in that slide, was he wanted to put heavy taxes on the wealthy, and then he didn't like the banks also as well. I think one thing that Coughlin wanted to do was he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve. Just eliminate it. He thought that the Federal Reserve was one of the big causes, why the economy crashed in the Great Depression. Now, what happened later, his show was canceled. I don't know if you know about this, but you saw how he got in trouble later under the Espionage Act, where he kind of was too supportive of like Hitler and Mussolini. He kind of thought that what the fascists were doing in Europe was the right thing to do. We should do doing stuff like them, be more conservative like they were. He was also anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic as well. And so FDR somehow got his radio show canceled and all that. So that's basically who Charles Coughlin was and all that, so-called radio priest. So he's probably one of the most famous of the anti-New Dealers that was out there. Then they got this guy, of course, Dr. Francis Townsend, who had a so-called Townsend Plan, you may have heard of. And he was another famous anti-New Dealer who was actually a California doctor. I think he was retired. And Townsend felt like the elderly weren't being taken care of. And so what he believed they ought to do is create some kind of pension for the retired, people that retired. So he came up with this so-called Townsend Plan, they dubbed it, which became very popular. And so much they started these clubs called the Townsend Clubs, like in the 1930s and all that. And how it worked, by the way, was that Townsend proposed that every person over 60 be paid $200 a month, like in a pension. And it would be supported by some kind of national sales tax, which is kind of like, Social Security, right? Today, how it is. And the only thing what his plan, though, was a little different was that they had to spend it within so many days. It's like 30 days, basically. And it was kind of a way to stimulate the economy in the United States. So you had to spend it, actually. So that's kind of the idea of it. And so they think that Townsend's idea of the Townsend Plan was what influenced later FDR to create the Social Security Administration, the Social Security that we have now, which is a little later, I think in 1938 when that came out, more or less. So that's what the Townsend Plan was, and of course, Dr. Francis Townsend, who, of course, popularized that. Then you got, of course, the Southern man, of course, you've probably heard of, which is Huey P. Long, the so-called kingfish, of course, from Louisiana. I think everybody knows him here in this state. Huey P. Long, of course, very popular Democratic senator, governor of Louisiana. Of course, he was governor from 1928 to 1932, also senator from 1932 to 1935. If you know much about Long and his political machine, as they called it, was practically almost like a dictatorship, the way it controlled the state. I don't know if you heard of the deduct box, something my mom used to tell me about. But if you worked for the government under Long, you had to give him money or they'd fire you. Like donate, I guess, to his campaign or whatever it is. I remember she told me about that story. But Long is kind of important to Louisiana. I don't know if you know much about it, but he was important in modernizing the state. That's something that's true about Long. Like Long is the one that kind of started promoting a lot of the schools. Like you ever wonder why you get like free lunches in school, right? It's because of Huey P. Long. Came up with that idea. Also textbooks, free textbooks also as well. He began to build hospitals throughout Louisiana. Of course, there's a couple bridges he helped build, like the Huey Long Bridge, New Orleans, also one in Baton Rouge, of course, named after him as well, the older bridge that's there. Also built a lot of roads throughout, because I think most Louisiana was like gravel roads or whatever. He started building paved roads throughout the country. Also, he helped build the Louisiana State Capitol, which was, by the way, finished in 1932 as well. And he also did influence in, by the way, in developing Louisiana State University. It was kind of like his pet project. You know about that? He's the one that helped develop the marching band, Golden Band from Tigerland. He helped develop it, as you know. Now, what Long is famous for, by the way, is this idea he had, which was called the Share the Wealth Plan, which, by the way, was in one of his books he wrote, which was a biography about himself. He had a book he wrote called Every Man a King. It was an autobiography. He kind of talks about it in there, in that book. Anyway, under this plan, basically, he would levy 100% tax on all money that was over $1 million. So if you made $2 million, that meant that they would tax half of it. So it'd all be allocated back to the people, is what they would do. So he had all kinds of plans, which are there. Also, the Share the Wealth Plan guaranteed a family annual income of $2,000 a year that they would give to people. Free college education also as well. They had a pension plan too. He came up with two, kind of similar like the Townsend Plan as well. So he had those all kinds of ideas. Veterans benefits, you can see. Also, he was one of the first to advocate the idea of a healthcare system, like a one-payer system, I think was kind of something he came up with, by the way. And he had a motto for his plan, which was called, "Every man a king, but no man wears a crown." So that's basically, King and his ideas with that. But he was like a demigod, this powerful, American politician who, practically controlled Louisiana. And he was kind of like a buffoon. Like when he went to Washington, he was known for these long speeches that he would give. I gave that little short speech at the beginning where he was trying to compare Democrats versus Republicans, which I think Long thought they were kind of both the same, kind of somewhat. But yeah, Long was kind of this guy that would get up. If they have like a filibuster, they'd use him. And he would just talk forever. Huey Long. Now, Long was considered a threat, by the way, to FDR. Actually, in 1936, he was going to run for president, which is true about that. In fact, I don't know if he would have won or not. But if you know about what happened to Long, he got shot by this man named Dr. Carl Weiss, who was a doctor in Baton Rouge, who was actually mad at him because of the fact that Long had done something to like his father-in-law's. He was a judge in Louisiana, and he had gerrymandered his district where his father would lose his job, basically. And so he went up to the state capitol to confront him about it. And supposedly they think that Carl Weiss actually he struck Long in the face. And if you know about Long, Long had a bunch of bodyguards that he had. They think they opened up on Carl Weiss. They shot him like a bunch of times. They think a bullet hit the marble wall and hit Long and mortally wounded him. He later died afterwards. It's actually around near the governor's offices on that first floor when you come into the actual state capitol. And I think some of the bullet holes are still there. You still see him where he got shot right there. So yeah, Long would die, like I said, 1935. And so basically, yeah, I don't know if he would have been able to defeat FDR. His New Deal program was just, too popular for that time. Right, I'm going to, of course, move on next, of course, to talk about, 1936 election. FDR would run for re-election, and he ran against the Republican from Kansas, who was governor, named Alf Landon, Al for Alfred, basically. And so that he was like the biggest threat, really, to FDR. And the best thing that Alf could come up with, by the way, was the famous slogan. He said, "I can do it better," which I don't think it worked well. So that didn't really work well. You can see from this map that pretty much FDR clobbered him in the 1936 election. In fact, it's considered one of the greatest landslides in American history. I want to say until Reagan won, I think, when I think he won all the states except one, except Minnesota, I think it was. Was that 1984? I think it was. So yeah, like he won 472 electoral votes, which I think is one of the most that maybe an American politician ever won, in an election. And you can see Landon only got 53 electoral votes, excuse me. So yeah, FDR is going to go on to get elected 4 times. I think we've talked about this before, but he wins in 32, 1936, 1940, and 1944. So the only president to actually serve 3-4 terms. He, of course, dies in the 4th term. We'll get to later. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and, of course, move on. We're going to, of course, talk a little about the so-called Second New Deal a little bit. And, of course, I will move on also to kind of get into at least the background towards World War II, because we're going to get into World War II later in the week. And then, of course, next week I'll get into the Cold War era later. And yeah, there's a lot of different programs we haven't really talked about that were also part of the so-called Second New Deal. That's the majority of them that were probably part of it. Social Security, of course, United States Housing Authority, you may have heard of that. Of course, the Fair Labor Standards Act is another one I'll talk about. That's big. Then, of course, they have the AAA of 1938. That's another Agricultural Adjustment Act. I guess I'll mention that one briefly again if you want. I guess I'll talk about that one first if you want, that they had. But they had that one, of course, I'll get into, which is the AAA. I don't think I've got a slide on that one. I don't think I do. I've got Social Security. Yeah, there it is, of course, right there. Yeah, they had 2 of those. They had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, of course, of 1933. That one was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The second one, the second AAA, was more of a type of act that was geared towards subsidy payments that dealt more with conservation of the soil. So they would give, subsidies again to farmers like they did in the first AAA, except it had to do more with conservation of the national soil. And then also they wanted to create a kind of a balance of commodities. That's one thing they were kind of worried about was, having too many crops or too less crops. And so since 1938, that's part of what the federal government has done to do that, which they still do today. That act is still in power today overall. It also provided for crops that were considered too large, they would store them, is what they would do. So you can still, they'd still, I guess, sell these crops or whatever, but they would, just store them if there were too many. And then, of course, it's something that's very famous, too, the AAA, if you know about this. Also, it began to insure crops, something they're kind of known for. Drought, bad weather, plant disease, et cetera, those kind of things. And it led to the creation of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, FCIC, which, by the way, is still around today. So that's something that was kind of part of what the AAA was. But yeah, it's kind of some federal regulation, of the, agricultural, industry or whatever. But not like, I think it wasn't as the first one was. I think the first one was too much regulation. That's why it got declared unconstitutional. Now, also, I did want to talk about also as well, like I said, the so-called Social Security. That's another thing, of course, that was big in Social Security. I'll go ahead and do that one first. Social Security, that was created in 1935, you can see. And like I said, it was created because of the fact that, this guy, Townsend, it was kind of coming up with his own plan. And so what occurred eventually was FDR and Congress worked to create like a pension for retirees, which actually ended up being 65 and older. Now I think it's more like 67 to get the full benefits, I believe. But it's just not just that. It dealt with like that, unemployment, also insurance was part of that as well. Also provides Social Security, like, pensions or whatever, for those that are handicapped or blind. It does. So that was something that, of course, that they created. It was all funded primarily through, your FICA, payroll taxes, basically federal income tax, that kind of thing with the payroll that they do today. Of course, Social Security, is kind of controversial, and some people think it might not last, because you don't have enough people putting money into it, et cetera. Especially like a lot of the older people now taking a lot of money out, and the younger people, maybe not as many people working, and so that may cause a problem later. And of course, I don't get Social Security. I have, of course, a state pension, of course. So yeah, I don't know. I think if I had another job, maybe on the side, I could maybe get half credit, and that's pretty much it. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of what Social Security is. Now, also, something else that's very famous too in the Second New Deal, I did want to mention, is the U.S. Housing Authority. They got that too. That's also famous. That was part of like the Second New Deal. This basically created an agency that would lend money either to states or people that wanted to create like low-cost housing. And so it's an idea to nationalize housing. And the reason why they did this was because of the fact that there was a housing shortage, like in the 1930s and 1940s, which was pretty severe. I think it was even up to like the 1950s. It was kind of a problem with that, with the lack of housing. And so the federal government stepped in and provided up to, you can see, $500 million in loans that people could get for low-cost housing. They still had shortage even after that, believe it or not. Can you believe it? Anyway, during World War II, the USHA actually lent, eventually, like during the war itself later, $750 million to build something like 150-something thousand or more houses, because they had all these war industries that kind of sprung up during the war, all the big cities, and so they had to basically build housing and so on. But like I said, there was still a shortage of housing, and it was really difficult if you were like a minority, like not like non-white or whatever. It was very difficult, and sometimes get housing. It was later abolished, by the way. And you can see it was actually superseded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is still around today, which was created under LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, when he was president in the 1960s, part of his Great Society programs and all that. But you can see that they could get low interest loans. You can up to 60 years, which is crazy. I wish I could get that. Huh? I doubt if you ever pay it off though, that kind of thing. So anyway. There's one more I did want to mention too. Also, they had the Fair Labor Standards Act as well. That was part of the so-called Second New Deal. This is actually a pretty interesting act today. If you know about it. If you know about it, what it did was it's one of the first federal laws or whatever that provided a minimum wage throughout the country, which, believe it or not, was 25 cents. That was the original minimum wage, 25 cents an hour. And of course, it also provided for a maximum work week, which was originally 44 weeks when it was created in 1938. Then during World War II in 1940, they went to 40 hours. Also the FLSA, that act, which is still around today legally, it abolished pretty much child labor up to certain ages, especially under 16. And then also it set overtime rates. So basically, if you work over 40 hours, they have to give you time and a half, et cetera. And so this is something that's still around today. And by the way, the Federal Labor Standards Act is part of the Department of Labor. It still enforces it, today pretty much. So all these were, various, programs that were part of the New Deal, but a lot of them are gone. Like a lot of them are not around much anymore today. Like you've got, Social Security, I think one of the most famous that's still around today. The TVA is still around. That Fair Labor Standards Act is still around. So they got some programs which are the AA of 1938. That one's still around as well. That act was passed anyway. But a lot of them are not around anymore. They pretty much got rid of them, of course, since really, I guess, going up to more closer to the Cold War era. All right, I'm going to, of course, move on today. And before I go, I did want to talk about one thing, and then I will move on to kind of, talk about mostly the beginning of World War II. But yeah, what's the legacy of the New Deal? Did it really solve the problems, of the Great Depression? That's highly disputed. It's a big disputed issue today, which historians are still talking about. And I think it kind of helped alleviate it. You can see actually that unemployment dropped from 13 million to 9 million. So yeah, obviously helped a little bit decrease it. But even still, you had a lot of people that are still unemployed that were there. There's some other programs I forgot to talk about. FDIC, SEC, yeah, those are still around also as well. Pretty much kept farmers pretty much subsidized afterwards overall. And the one thing that did come out of this whole thing, with the New Deal, which I always talk about, is the fact that the New Deal helped create a larger bureaucracy with the federal government, which it did. The 1930, 600,000 employees, by the way, were part of the federal government. And then after that, like World War I and all that, World War II and all that, it's over 1 million people that are being employed. So obviously it created a huge bureaucracy. And so the federal government started getting bigger and bigger. And of course, got larger in the World War II and the Cold War in the future. So yeah, that's the legacy of the New Deal. But they do think that what really got us out of the Great Depression was not the New Deal. It was World War II. Because the fact of all these armaments industries that were created, it helped boost the economy later. And so after World War II, when we were like one of the few superpowers left, us and the Soviets, we became an economic powerhouse. So that's the next thing I did want to talk about and get into today, is kind of talk about, the United States, the fact that, we start, getting involved in World War II. Of course, primarily we were involved in the war, from 1941 to 1945. Because after, Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th of 1941. But I'll kind of go into today and kind of talk about, what's going on in Europe. We get involved. I'll get to that later. But, before the outbreak of the war, I'll talk about how the fact that the United States became this country that was isolated. We kind of, favored isolationism. We didn't really want to get involved in Europe's problems. In fact, we rejected the League of Nations. The United States never joined it, not officially. I think we kind of supported it somewhat, but we never joined it. And one of the things that, of course, I'll get into and I'll talk about later will be the rise of fascism. I'll kind of talk about that as a major issue of why, World War II happens. But let me first talk about what happened with the United States, prior to, World War II kind of coming in. Well, between the wars, there's a lot of things that really, where the United States tried to really stop immigration to the country, because a lot of people had lost their jobs and all that. So we kind of feared immigrants coming in here. It was a combination of that and also a lot of their radical views. They thought a lot of people in Europe were had radical ideas like, communism, fascism. They were also not Protestant, because I think most people in America were Protestant, about that. So all these Catholics and so on coming into the country, which they didn't want. Jews also as well, I think, were coming in. They didn't want that either as well. And so what happened was the United States Congress enacted a bunch of immigration quotas, which you can see there. They had the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, National Origins Act of 1929. Both those were passed. And what those two acts did, by the way, they limited the number of immigrants to the country based on the total nationality that were living in America at the time. So if there were so many like Poles, like Polish people living in the country, say, I don't know, 300,000, only a certain percentage would get in a year. So say 3% a year would come in out of that amount, was how it basically would work. So you can see that it kind of got to the point where it was a trickle of people coming in. So 3% in 1921 was the percentage origin. And then by 1929, it dropped to 1%. So very few people were able to come into the country, during the Great Depression and all that. And they didn't really want them in there anyway because there was no jobs. Also, between the wars, they raised the tariffs. If you know about that too, I think I already mentioned already when I was talking about the Hawley-Smoot tariff that was passed under Herbert Hoover's administration. They thought tariffs had caused the Great Depression, so they raised them like a lot. And so they actually, did that. They think it helped to contribute, by the way, to making the Great Depression worse. In fact, it made it so bad that the Great Depression spread worldwide. So it affected Europe, it affected Latin America, it affected Asia. And so obviously it helped to tank other people's economies as well. We weren't buying as many foreign products and things like that. And so, it led to the rise of fascism in other countries. And of course, the fascists, rose to power too, because a lot of people lost faith in democracy, lost faith in capitalism. And so fascism became more popular, more or less. And that's the next thing I did want to talk about too, of course, is the rise of fascism, which becomes big, in the 1920s and 30s. Like in Europe, we'll kind of get into it, but World War II broke out primarily because of World War I. It was, the main cause of it. And if you remember correctly, the Allies had been deeply punished through the Treaty of Versailles. And so the Germans, it killed their economy. They were forced to pay heavy, like $32 billion worth of war reparations. They lost a lot of prestige. They lost territory in Europe, Africa, and all their colonies. And so the Germans felt like they got stabbed in the back and all that. And so it led to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. Also to Italy, you got the rise of Benito Mussolini. And so that occurred there. Also in Europe, they had also fascism as well. Like in Japan, you see them rising to power. And what exactly is fascism? Well, I'll give you a definition of it. It's basically this type of right-wing political ideology that's more extreme, compared to other ideas ideologically. And they tend to favor being very extreme nationalists. They kind of put the country ahead of everything else overall. They're very anti-communist. They don't like communists. In fact, the fascists, if you know about it, are the enemies of communism. Yeah, communists, or communist, socialists, anarchists, basically, and of course also very totalitarian. There's a lack of democracy under a lot of these regimes that came to power. So I think they count Francisco Franco in Spain also as kind of being somewhat of a fascist or right-wing leaning, dictator, more or less. And one of the first, of course, they always talk about is Italian fascism. It became real popular. You know about this in the 1920s because of Benito Mussolini, who was this ex-veteran of World War I, who kind of saw the communists as a threat, that they were going to try to take power in the country. And so Mussolini eventually marched on the government, and he was able to get the fascists to take over Italy's government, the Kingdom of Italy at the time. And so Mussolini ends up being prime minister from 1922 to about 1943. And Mussolini went by a title, which was the Il Duce, which meant the leader, is what it meant. And Hitler kind of does the same thing as well. He kind of models himself after Mussolini overall, and has kind of similar kind of right-wing tendencies also as well. Hey, what's up, Tony? What's going on? So yeah, kind of talking about the rise of fascism and all that came to power. The term fascism, by the way, came from the so-called fasci, which was a ancient Roman symbol, which you see in that picture right there. And what happened was Mussolini incorporated it into the Italian flag. They started using it. And what Mussolini wanted to do was he wanted to take Italy and make it into this modernized Roman Empire type state that would control the Mediterranean Sea. And so fasci was supposedly a symbol of power and authority, like of Roman leaders, etc. And so that's how he kind of styled himself as this almost like a new Caesar, like in modern times or whatever. And Italy, as a fascist power, does try to take over like Africa. Like, they go into like Ethiopia, take that, what they call Abyssinia. They take over Libya. I think during World War II, they also try to invade Albania and Greece. So he's trying to expand his empire to control parts of the Mediterranean region. But Mussolini was kind of a weak fascist compared to, say, Adolf Hitler, of course, who we'll also talk about as well. So, yeah, you've got, of course, Hitler, who's very famous. Hitler, of course, later is the Chancellor of Germany, Nazi Germany, later called the Führer. Of course, one of the founders of what will be later called Nazi Germany, or what they call the Third Reich. There he is right there. A little background about Hitler. Hitler was actually from Austria. He was an Austrian native who had fought in World War I, just like Mussolini had. But he kind of dreamed of like a great Germany that would be unified together with Austria overall. And 1920s and 30s, of course, the Nazis rose to power in Germany. The Nazi Party, as you know, was a very anti-Semitic and anti-communist, political party in Germany. They were known as the NSDAP, known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP for short. Also, they were big against the Treaty of Versailles. That's one of the things I guess Hitler would kind of give speeches about a lot. And part of why Hitler became so popular was because of the fact that he was a great speaker. He could enthrall the audience. He was known for like starting really slow in his speeches and then just become like real violent. Eventually he would seize power, which took a while. It took Hitler something like almost 10 years or so to eventually take power in Germany, but he eventually took over Germany in 1933. And one of the things that, Hitler would do, between the wars, as you know, is that they began to rearm Germany. They began to militarize Germany again, which hadn't done that really since World War I, more or less. So they kind of started like mass conscription in the country of all, German males. They began developing pretty much not just an army, but they also developed the so-called German Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. They also even kind of tried to develop the German Navy, along with, I guess, redevelopment of their U-boat fleets that they had before overall. The Germans would eventually, they would take over most of, they would start taking back Europe, more or less. If you look here, the Germans would retake the Rhineland in 1936, which had been created into a demilitarized zone by the Allies after World War I. He annexed Austria into Germany, was another thing he did in 1938. In 1938-39, if you know what happened, also, the Nazis also were able to take over Czechoslovakia, absorb it into the Third Reich as well. So you start taking all this territory, which a lot of it was part of the German Empire before the war, that they took back. Eventually, what caused World War II to break out, if you know about it, was that the Nazis under Hitler, Germany, invaded Poland, which the date was, by the way, September 1st, 1939. That would, of course, spark World War II. And that would cause actually France and Britain to declare war on Germany something like 2 days later, September 3rd. I think Hitler thought they wouldn't declare war, especially Britain, but they did. And so that started what would be basically a 6-year war. World War II would last 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, causing something like 60 million dead. Well, it's kind of a debate about how many it was, but about 60 million may have been killed at the most in World War II. And the different powers that were in the war, I did want to mention that were in World War II. Of course, they had the Axis powers. These were the main powers that fought basically against the Allies in World War II. They were, of course, Germany, Italy, and Japan. I think there was also some other states like, I think Hungary for a while, Romania also kind of supported the Axis powers also as well. And then they would fight the Allied powers, which we'll get to later, which will be at first, like it's all Britain, France, were the initial allies. They were part of that. And later you have the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. Those would be those are the 5 main powers that opposed the Allies in the war. Although France got defeated in 1940, if you know about that, and the Free France organization kind of took its place for a while there. So that's kind of initially, what's going on in Europe at that time. Here's, of course, more causes, of World War II. Yeah, besides the Treaty of Versailles, they do think nationalism was another cause, especially extreme nationalism in Europe, like with Germany, Italy, Japan, thinking they're superior to everybody else. Worldwide depression. Yeah, of course, that had a lot to do with it. A lot of these dictatorships, of course, created it. The policy of appeasement. Yeah, I didn't really go into that, but, the Western powers like Britain under Neville Chamberlain thought they could appease Hitler, and it didn't work, of course. And they think American isolationism, which I will talk about too a little bit today, was another cause, because we could have probably prevented maybe, these wars from breaking out if we had done more as a power. But the United States really just didn't want to get involved in all these problems in Europe and Asia, I guess at that time. I've got a few minutes left. Let me talk about a few more things about what happened with the United States, like between the wars. Now, it's kind of laughable, which it's true about this, but actually the United States for a while tried to not get involved in the war. In fact, it was actually a case where I think in the 1930s, where the United States tried to ban war. There was that thing called, I wanted to mention about, if I could find it, the Kellogg-Briand Act, I think it was. I think was an attempt by a bunch of powers, the United States, and I think the French got together. It's funny about this. They tried to ban war, which is kind of ridiculous. But that was one thing, of course, for that. But the main thing, of course, that happened was the United States passed a bunch of these neutrality acts in the mid to late 1930s, which would keep the United States neutral, directly involved in any kind of conflict or war. But one of the things that happened, though, if you know about it, was after World War II broke out in 1939, the United States started supporting their allies, like the British mostly, and the French. And so we were concerned that war might break out anytime soon, like it did in World War I. And so one of the things that the United States did as a power, we started to strengthen our defenses militarily in the country. The big thing that happened, if you know about it, was they had a draft they started, which was called the Burke-Wadsworth Act in 1940, which was actually called Selective Training and Service Act. And what it did was it started registering and drafting men throughout the country, where you had to register for selective service. And the ages for it, by the way, I'll put up here, was for 21 to 35. Those are the main ages. I think selective service is now 18 to 26. I think it is now. That's what it is. If you're a male, you have to register for that, selective service. And they have that in case there's a big war. They don't have a draft anymore, but if there's a big war that breaks out, that's where they're going to draft people that are 18 to 26 initially, which would be the best age for soldiers, pretty much. And so they started drafting people. People started serving 1939, 1941 at peacetime during the war. But you can see up to 10 million men at one point were drafted into the war. Both my uncles served in World War II in the U.S. Navy. I think mostly in the Pacific is where they were. So yeah, you have that going on. And then, of course, the other thing that happened too is the United States started, like I said, started sending military aid to the Allies. I think at first Britain and then also, I guess, the Free French, the Soviets, and China. And FDR did not want to send men. He wanted to send arms. And so he talked about this idea of the so-called arsenal of democracy. Send bombs, instead of men. And so that's at first what we tried to do initially. But what happened was, which I'll get to later, there's several things that kind of would lead to that, to kind of prevent that. But we had different policies we tried at first. I know in 1939, the United States and Congress came up with this idea called the cash and carry policy. It was this idea where countries like Britain that were fighting the Germans in World War II could actually come over and pick up any kind of equipment they needed for like the war. And so we gave them a bunch of destroyers and stuff like that. I know there was like a trade from I think there was a trade for like ships for, we traded them like equipment for like bases, like in Greenland, Iceland, things like that, which freed up a lot of, British forces so they could fight, the Germans in Europe, etc. So they had that initially. So they had to come pick up their equipment first. But later we had the Lend-Lease Act that was passed by Congress, which became even bigger than cash and carry. And this was a huge aid program where we gave practically free aid to all the Allied powers: Britain, Soviet Union, Republic of China, the Free France movement. So all this stuff was, sent to them. We started shipping it to them, back to Europe, to Asia. And that's kind of what happened to cause a lot of the problems, later, because we started shipping, stuff in our own ships. The Germans started sinking them, which is true about that. And it led to kind of this undeclared war in 1941, where in like the Atlantic Ocean, mostly the Germans were sinking ships at will with their U-boats or submarines. And it was one of the things that helped us drag us in the war, because I think we probably would have gotten in the war anyway. I want to say by 1942, but we're going to talk about it later. The thing that's going to really get the United States, into the war is going to be Japan. Japan's going to be, the one that's going to attack us, who are more of a threat in Asia and the Pacific. So you'll get that occur, of course. So I'll kind of get more into that later, of course, later in the week. Here's some other slides on some of these policies that they had, which are right here. So yeah, that destroyers for bases deal, where we kind of just swap with that, where we took British bases, we gave them like military equipment that they had. Lend-Lease, of course, right there. You can see here the amount of money it was spent. So close to something like $50 billion was the amount of money they spent on Lend-Lease. And was something to talk about that. I think FDR, there's a story they always tell about where FDR tried to talk people into it by his so-called, he used to give these so-called fireside chats. And you heard about this during the so-called New Deal era and during like also World War II. And FDR kind of compared the whole Lend-Lease thing to the fact that your neighbor's house is on fire and he needs like a garden hose to put it out. And so what you're going to do is help him. So the idea is to give all this equipment, to them. They defeat fascism worldwide, arsenal democracy. But But a lot of times they didn't give it back. I think they were supposed to give the equipment back. A lot of them either didn't, but who wants a burned out tank anyway? That kind of thing. But it was pretty much a free program, the Lend-Lease Act. And I think without that, I think the Soviets would have been defeated, like on the Eastern Front in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So that's like one of the pivotal campaigns of the whole war, the Eastern Front, because I think Hitler lost World War II because of the Eastern Front, overall. So that's pretty much it lecture-wise today. Later, like in the week, Tuesday, Thursday, coming up this week, I'm going to have 2 lectures, of course, on mostly World War II. They'll have, like I said, I'm shifting my schedule. It's going to be more of a 2-day week, I think, after that. Tuesday, Thursday is pretty much from the rest of the time on from this week and the next 2 weeks after that overall. So I'm going to be covering, pretty much up through like mostly World War II up through the Cold War. That's about it. I'll probably be able to do likely. If I have time for post-Cold War, I might mention a little bit also as well. But don't forget, first exam is going to expire tonight. Try to get that done, of course. And then I have posted a new assignment, the second exam, which is mostly going to cover from World War I, Roaring '20s, up to like the Great Depression, the New Deal. So make sure you start working on that. There's not too much left. We have some assignments left, I know. I've got like the final exam later. They got the research paper also as well coming up. So we don't have too many assignments left coming up. We've got like just a few that I'll have. But the semester's coming up. The end of it's coming pretty quick. So we'll be done pretty much soon. So that's it for today. Like I said, I hope y'all had a great spring break. We'll try to, see if we can finish strong, for the end of the semester. So y'all take care, and I'll see you later in the week.